Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Sergey Shcherbakov and the quiet, bone-deep dread that settled over the Soviet Union in the year 1985. Imagine, if you will, the vast landscape of the motherland, where the air is a heavy weight and the silence is so profound it feels as though the world itself has stopped breathing. We begin our journey in a time of transition, where the old ways of the Soviet era were beginning to show their cracks, and something far more sinister was moving through the frozen periphery. The frost was not just a season. It was an atmosphere that seeped into the very floorboards of the homes in the industrial heartlands. It is here, amidst the biting wind and the gray, early morning light, that our story takes its first dark turn. Breathe in the cold air with me. Let the world outside your window fade into the distance as we travel back to a place where the shadows grew long and the ice held onto its secrets for far too long. The year 1985 was a pivotal moment in history, but for the people living near the great waterways and the coal-dusted towns, it was simply another cycle of survival against the elements. The Volga River, massive and unyielding, lay under a thick shroud of white. In the harsh winter months, the ice becomes a landscape of its own, a jagged mirror reflecting a sky the color of lead. People walked across its frozen surface, their heavy wool coats and fur hats providing the only barrier against a temperature that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lips. In this environment, every sound is amplified. The crunch of boots on packed snow sounds like breaking bone. The distant whistle of a train feels like a mournful cry. It was in this setting that a certain stillness began to change. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, but a gradual realization that the familiar landscape had become a hunting ground. The community was close-knit, bound by the shared struggle of the era, yet a new kind of isolation was beginning to take root in the corners of the public consciousness. In the town of Leninsk-Kuznetsky, nestled in the industrial reaches, where the frost lingers well into the spring, the winter of 1985 felt particularly oppressive. Sergey Shcherbakov was a man who seemed to belong to this landscape. He was 23 years old, an underground electrician at the local mine. To his neighbors, he was quiet, perhaps a bit inconspicuous, a man who had returned from his army service with a hardened edge. He lived in the private sector of the town, a place of modest wooden houses and narrow lanes that turned into labyrinths when the snow piled high. People saw him pushing a pram through the slush, a domestic image that should have inspired a sense of peace. He told his wife, Irina, that he was simply transporting building materials to expand their home. But inside that pram, hidden beneath the blankets and the wood, was a heavy hammer. It was a tool of his trade, but in the coming months, it would become the instrument of a nightmare that the local militia was wholly unprepared to solve. The first discovery occurred when the thaw was just beginning to tease the edges of the frozen earth in early May of 1985. The victim was Tatyana Berdugina, a 27-year-old woman who carried the most precious of burdens. She was pregnant. She had been staying at the local hospital, resting to ensure the health of her unborn child, and had been granted a brief leave for the May holidays. The air that morning was still sharp, a remnant of the winter frost that refused to fully retreat. When she did not return, the silence that followed was heavy. Her body was eventually found in an area near school number 10. The crime scene was stark and hauntingly empty. In the vast, white expanse of the clearing, the investigators found almost nothing to lead them to a suspect. There was only one small, jarring detail that stood out against the purity of the snow: a single matchbox. On its cardboard surface, there was a tiny, dark spot of blood. It was a minute piece of evidence, easily missed by a less observant eye, yet it was the first signature of a man who would soon be known as the Spider. The militia officers stood around the site, their own breath blooming in white clouds as they looked down at the evidence. In 1985, the tools of forensic science were primitive compared to what we know today. There were no digital databases, no rapid DNA testing. There were only black and white photographs, charcoal rubbings, and the intuition of men who had spent their lives in a system that often preferred order over the messy reality of a predator in their midst. The discovery of Tatiana sent a ripple of quiet dread through the town. Mothers held their children closer as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The streets, once seen as safe under the watchful eye of the Soviet state, now felt exposed. Shcherbakov, meanwhile, remained in the shadows. He was a man fueled by a deep-seated resentment, a bitterness born from a broken heart, and a life that felt as cold as the Siberian wind. He watched the panic grow from a distance, perhaps even finding a dark satisfaction in the way the frost of fear began to mirror the frost on the ground. As the days stretched on, the initial shock of the discovery began to settle into a permanent state of unease. The local authorities increased their patrols, but the killer was someone who knew the rhythms of the town as well as they did. He was a ghost in the machine of the industrial state. The people of the region began to look at one another differently. The man at the bus stop, the neighbor clearing his walk, the worker at the mine, anyone could be the source of the violence. But Shcherbakov was particularly adept at blending in. He was sometimes called the handsome one by those who knew him, a nickname that hid the darkness beneath his skin. He moved through the world with a hammer in his pocket and a pram full of secrets, waiting for the next moment when the world would turn its back. As we close this first chapter, the frost still lies heavy across the land, and the mystery of the matchbox remains unsolved. The dread is only just beginning to bloom, like a dark flower in the middle of a white winter. Stay with me as we continue to follow the path of the spider through the shadows of 1985. The night air in Leninsk-Kuznetsky during the early days of May, 1985, carried the heavy, metallic scent of the nearby coal mines, a scent that usually promised the comfort of industry and home. But on the grounds of School Number 10, the air felt different. It was thin and cold, clinging to the investigators of the militia as they knelt in the tall, unkempt grass. They worked under the flickering, amber glow of handheld lanterns, their beams cutting through the oppressive Soviet night like dim needles. The ground here was a tapestry of damp earth and emerging spring growth, yet it held a secret that would soon haunt the entire Kemerovo region. As they moved, the soft crunch of their boots on the gravel was the only sound in the suffocating silence. They were looking for something, anything, that could explain why the peace of their town had been shattered so abruptly and so cruelly. The first piece of evidence was almost impossibly small, a tiny object that seemed utterly mundane until the light of a torch fell upon it. Nestled against the base of a weathered brick wall was a simple matchbox. It was made of thin, cheap wood and covered in a faded paper label, the kind found in every kitchen and pocket across the Soviet Union. But as the lead investigator leaned closer, his breath blooming in the frigid air, he saw it. A single, dark spot. It was a drop of blood, no larger than a berry, dried into a deep, rust-colored stain on the porous surface of the wood. In 1985, this was a monumental find. There were no cameras perched on the corners of the buildings, no digital footprints to follow. There was only this small, wooden box, discarded in the shadows, carrying a silent testimony to the violence that had occurred only hours before. The forensic technology available to the militia at that time was a far cry from the sophisticated laboratories we imagine today. They worked with what they had, a mixture of meticulous observation and the burgeoning science of serology. Each piece of evidence was handled with a reverence that bordered on the religious. They placed the matchbox into a small paper envelope, sealing it with a care that felt like a quiet prayer for the victim, Tatiana Berdugina. She had been only 27 years old, a woman whose life was supposed to be defined by the new life she was carrying. Instead, the investigators were left to piece together her final moments from the indentations in the dirt. They looked for fingerprints on the rough wood of the matchbox, hoping for a whorl or a ridge that might identify the monster in their midst. But the cool night air and the dampness of the ground had made such a discovery difficult. As the investigation expanded, the militia began to find more curious, disjointed clues that seemed to point toward a very specific type of individual. Near another site, they discovered strange gauze bags, the kind used for chemical protection in the industrial mines. They were light, airy things, now discarded and fluttering like dead moths in the breeze. Then there was the mention of a tent, a large, heavy piece of fabric that seemed out of place in the urban outskirts. The detectives puzzled over these items, trying to weave them into a coherent narrative. Why would a killer carry gauze? Why leave behind a tent? It suggested someone who was comfortable in the rough, someone who moved through the private sectors and the industrial zones with a sense of belonging. The lack of DNA testing meant they had to rely on blood typing, a process that could only narrow the field of suspects, never pinpoint a single man. They were searching for a ghost among millions of people who all looked the same in the dim light of the street lamps. Perhaps the most unsettling detail emerged from the whispers of the local residents. Witnesses began to speak of a man who moved through the shadows with a pram. In the residential quarters of Leninsk-Kuznetsky, a man pushing a baby carriage was the ultimate symbol of domesticity and safety. It was a camouflage so perfect it was almost invisible. The militia heard stories of this figure appearing near the crime scenes, the wheels of the pram squeaking softly on the uneven pavement. Inside that carriage, they feared, lay not a child, but the tools of a predator. A hammer, a length of wire, and the stolen treasures of his victims. This detail turned every father, every husband, into a potential suspect. The very fabric of trust in the community began to fray, as neighbors watched neighbors through cracked curtains, wondering if the man they saw every day was the one leaving blood-stained matchboxes in the dark. The forensic teams spent hundreds of hours in their cramped, dimly lit offices, staring at black and white photographs of the scenes. They measured the depth of the boot prints in the mud, noting the wear on the heels, trying to determine the height and weight of the attacker. They analyzed the blood from the matchbox, determining the blood type with a series of chemical reactions that turned clear liquids into shades of blue and pink. It was slow, agonizing work. Every discovery felt like a single grain of sand in a vast desert. They knew the killer was changing his tactics, becoming bolder and more erratic. He was no longer just a shadow. He was a presence that felt as though it was breathing down the neck of the entire city. And yet, for all their efforts, the first evidence remained a mystery, a small wooden box that held its secrets tight, waiting for the one mistake that would finally bring Sergey Shcherbakov into the light. The transition from the sterile, paper-strewn offices of the investigators to the soot-stained streets of Leninsk-Kuznetsky was like moving between two different worlds. While the forensic teams obsessed over the graininess of their black and white photographs, the town itself was breathing a heavy, sulfurous air. In 1985, this industrial heartland was a place defined by the rhythm of the Yaroslavsky mine, where the coal dust seemed to settle into the very pores of the people. As the investigators began their rounds, knocking on the heavy wooden doors of communal apartments, they weren't just looking for clues. They were trying to map the social fabric of a community that was slowly unraveling under the weight of an invisible predator. The neighborhood was a maze of gray, concrete structures, often referred to as the neighborhood of shadows, where the sun seemed to struggle to pierce the smog of the local factories. Inside these homes, the atmosphere was one of forced normalcy. Neighbors shared kitchens and hallways, their lives intertwined by proximity and the shared silence of the Soviet era. But beneath the surface, a cold current of dread was beginning to flow, moving as silently as the coal cars deep beneath the earth. When the police spoke to the residents of these blocks, they encountered a strange dichotomy. On one hand, there was the collective memory of a town that looked out for its own. On the other, there was the growing realization that the monster they feared might be the person holding the door open for them. One name began to surface in the periphery of these conversations, though not as a suspect, at least, not yet. Sergey Shcherbakov was a man who seemed to embody the ideal of the young, Soviet worker. At 23 years of age, he was an underground electrician, a position that commanded a certain level of respect in a mining town. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, almost inconspicuous. He was the man who was often seen walking his wife, Irina, to and from her shifts at the factory. He told everyone he did it because he was worried about her safety, especially now that she was pregnant. It was a gesture that many found touching, an example of a devoted husband protecting his family during a time of rising uncertainty. They saw him as a guardian, never suspecting that the very man walking beside her was the source of the shadow lengthening over their streets. There was a specific detail that several neighbors mentioned during those long, afternoon interviews, a detail that seemed mundane at the time, but would later take on a chilling significance. Sergey was frequently seen pushing a pram through the uneven streets. It was a common sight in a neighborhood full of young families, but there was something slightly off about the way he handled it. He told the curious and the friendly that the carriage was filled with building materials, bricks and mortar for an extension he was planning for their modest home. The neighbors nodded, admiring his industriousness. They didn't hear the heavy, metallic thud of the hammer resting beneath the burlap sacks. They didn't see the way his fingers would sometimes twitch toward the handle of the tool while he spoke of the weather or the price of bread. The pram was a masterclass in deception, a piece of domestic equipment repurposed into a vessel for violence. In the communal courtyards, where children played near rusting swing sets, the spider was weaving his web in broad daylight, using the tools of fatherhood to mask the heart of a killer. By the middle of 1985, the social fabric of Lenin's Kuznetsky had begun to tear. The fear was no longer a whisper. It was a physical presence that altered the daily lives of thousands. Workers at the local enterprises began to refuse the evening shifts, terrified of the walk home through the unlit corridors between the housing blocks. The internal troops were eventually alerted, and police patrols were reinforced, but the town still felt vulnerable. The investigators heard stories of women carrying heavy kitchen knives in their handbags and men waiting at bus stops in groups of 5 or 6, eyes scanning the darkness. The local cinema, once a hub of activity, saw its attendance plummet. The streets, usually alive with the sounds of a working-class city, fell into a heavy, artificial silence as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Every footstep on the pavement was scrutinized. Every silhouette in a doorway was a potential threat. It was in this environment of heightened senses that the first whispers of a specific, recurring vision began to emerge from the community, a vision that didn't quite fit the summer heat of the current murders. An elderly woman, who lived in a ground-floor apartment near school number 10, provided a testimony that stayed with the investigators long after they left her cramped living room. She spoke of a memory from the very beginning of the year, during the tail end of a particularly harsh Siberian winter. It was a time when the snow was piled high against the concrete walls, and the wind howled through the gaps in the window frames. She recalled a late evening when the street lamps were flickering, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the white drifts. Through the frost-patterned glass, she had seen a figure moving through the deep snow. It wasn't the gait of a man heading home from the mines, or someone hurrying to escape the cold. The figure moved with a strange, deliberate slowness, almost as if he were hunting in the drifts. He was tall, wearing a heavy dark coat that seemed to absorb the little light available. He stopped near the playground, standing perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his gaze fixed on the darkened windows of the school's pathology department nearby. The woman described a feeling of intense, cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. She told the officers that the figure eventually vanished into the white haze of a sudden flurry, leaving no visible footprints behind. as if the snow itself had conspired to hide his path. At the time, she had dismissed it as a trick of the light or the wandering of a local drunk. But as the bodies began to appear in the spring and summer, the memory of that figure in the snow became a haunting anchor for the neighborhood's collective fear. This was the first mention of a shadow that preceded the blood, a specter that had been watching the town long before it began to bleed. As the investigators recorded her words, the hum of the Yaroslavsky mine continued in the distance, a constant reminder of the industrial machinery that kept the town alive. While somewhere in the labyrinth of the neighborhood of shadows, the handsome one was likely preparing his pram for another walk. The social fabric was not just tearing. It was being meticulously rewoven by a man who knew exactly how to hide in plain sight, waiting for the next flurry to mask his movements. The silence that followed the figure's disappearance into the white haze was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to cling to the frozen ground of Lenin's Kuznetsky. As the investigators stood in the very spot where the apparition had vanished, the unseasonable flurry of 1985 continued to dance around them, masking the world in a deceptive purity. They looked for the indentations of boots, the scuff of a heavy coat, or any sign of a human presence, but the landscape remained unmarred. It was as if the earth itself had conspired to protect the secret of the man who walked through the storm. The officers shared a look of profound unease, their breath blooming in the frigid air like ghostly flowers. They were men of logic and grit, accustomed to the harsh realities of a mining town in the heart of the Soviet Union. Yet this lack of evidence felt like a personal insult to their training. The initial incident had been treated as a singular tragedy, a flash of violence in an otherwise predictable social order. But as the snow began to settle over the pathology department's perimeter, a new feeling took root, a realization that the shadows were growing longer and much more purposeful than they had first dared to imagine. In the weeks following that first disappearance, the industrial rhythm of the city tried to reassert itself. The Yaroslavsky mine continued to breathe its soot and steam into the gray sky, and the workers moved like clockwork through the soot-stained streets. But beneath this surface-level stability, the investigation was shifting. It was no longer a search for a missing person or a lone assailant. It was becoming a hunt for a shadow. The detectives spent hours in cramped, dimly lit offices, surrounded by the smell of stale tobacco and the hum of distant machinery. They pored over maps of the district, marking the locations of every suspicious sighting and every strange occurrence. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that the call came in regarding what would later be known as the second incident. This development occurred several kilometers away from the original site, near a cluster of construction trailers that sat like rusted boxes against the horizon. The setting was stark, stripped of the domestic comforts of the city center, and it was here that the investigation would finally broaden its scope, revealing a pattern that would chill the blood of every resident in the Kemerovo region. The discovery was made by a worker arriving for the early shift, a man who had spent 30 years navigating the rough terrain of the industrial outskirts. He found the scene near a discarded pile of timber, where the earth was still damp from the recent thaw. Unlike the first event, which had been characterized by a clean, almost surgical vanishing, this second sight was a testament to raw, blunt force. The victim was a woman, a laborer who had been walking toward her post in the pale light of dawn. There was a brutality here that had been missing from the previous reports, a signature of violence that spoke of a different kind of motivation. The investigators noted the marks left in the soft soil, not the clear footprints they had hoped for, but the chaotic impressions of a struggle. More importantly, they found the weapon's calling card. The injuries were consistent with a heavy, metallic object, perhaps a tool commonly found in any one of the nearby mines. A hammer. The realization that a common implement of labor had been transformed into an instrument of terror was a turning point. It suggested that the killer was someone who moved among them unnoticed, someone who understood the tools of the trade and the rhythm of the working day. As the sun rose higher over Leninsk-Kuznetsky that day, the local authorities gathered in a makeshift command center. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and the metallic tang of the nearby ironworks. They laid out the files from the first incident alongside the fresh evidence from the second. The similarities were subtle but undeniable. Both victims had been targeted during the transition of light, one in the encroaching darkness of evening and the other in the fragile clarity of morning. Both locations were situated near high-traffic industrial zones, yet both provided just enough isolation for a predator to strike and vanish. The lead investigator, a man whose face was a map of 20 years of service, traced his finger over the connection. He noted that the second incident had occurred exactly 14 days after the first. This was not a coincidence. It was a cadence. The scope of the investigation exploded outward, moving beyond the immediate vicinity of the mines and into the domestic lives of the thousands of men who called this city home. They were no longer looking for a phantom. They were looking for a neighbor, a husband, or a son who carried a hammer in his pocket and a darkness in his heart. The realization that the first event was not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of a sequence, changed the very atmosphere of the city. People began to look at the familiar faces on the buses and in the bread lines with a new, sharp suspicion. The white haze of the snow had cleared, but it had been replaced by a psychological fog that was much harder to navigate. The investigation now prioritized the behavioral patterns of the workers at the Yaroslavsky mine, focusing on those who had access to the specific types of equipment used in the second attack. They looked for the quiet ones, the men like Sergey Shcherbakov, who moved through their shifts with a terrifying invisibility. It was in this broadening of the search that the police began to hear the whispers, stories of a man seen pushing a pram through the streets at odd hours, a man who seemed too handsome for the grim work of the mines, a man who always seemed to be exactly where the shadows were deepest. The second incident had provided the link, the crucial piece of the puzzle that turned a series of unfortunate events into a hunt for a serial predator. The hunter was now being hunted, but the investigators knew they were racing against a clock that was already winding up for its next strike. The pattern was set, the weapon was chosen, and the city of Leninsk-Kuznetsky waited in a state of breathless, terrifying anticipation for what the next 14 days might bring. The air in the headquarters of the Leninsk-Kuznetsky militia was thick with more than just the usual haze of strong tobacco and the heavy, clinical scent of floor wax. It was weighted by a growing silence that seemed to press against the ears of every officer working late into the evening of 1985. In a corner office, illuminated by a single lamp with a dented metal shade, the investigator pulled a heavy, cloth-bound volume from the shelf. This was the ledger, a physical manifestation of the city's collective anxiety. Its pages were filled with the meticulous, slanted handwriting of various clerks, recording the small and large tragedies of the region. As the investigator opened it, the spine creaked, a sound like dry bones snapping in the quiet room. He began to turn the pages slowly, his fingertips tracing the blue lines of the paper, looking for the ghost that had begun to haunt the districts. The transition from isolated incidents to a coordinated investigation was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, agonizing crawl through hundreds of unrelated reports, searching for a signature that the killer did not yet know he was leaving. The first entry of significance sat on the 7th of May, 1985. It was written in a dry, bureaucratic tone that stripped the event of its horror. A woman had been found, the victim of a brutal assault involving a heavy, blunt object. At the time, the local precinct had treated it as a crime of passion or a random act of street violence, common enough in the shadows of the mining district. But as the investigator flipped through the following weeks, the pattern began to whisper. He looked at the reports from different districts, realizing how the geography of the crimes obscured their connection. One file arrived from the northern outskirts, another from the heart of the private sector near the Yaroslavsky mine. In a time before computers and digital databases, information moved at the speed of a courier's bicycle or a crackling telephone line. The investigator began to lay the folders out across the floor, creating a map of tragedy that ignored the official boundaries of the precincts. He was looking for Sergey, though he did not yet have a name to put to the shadow. He only had the rhythm of the hammer blows and the chilling silence that followed each entry in the ledger. By the middle of the summer, the 15th of July to be exact, the ledger recorded 2 events on a single day that sent a shudder through the bureau. The first was a survivor, a young woman named Tatiana who had managed to escape the darkness, her life saved by a combination of luck and sheer will. But the second entry on that same page was a different story. Vera, a 15-year-old girl, had not been so fortunate in the quiet stretches of Gorky Park. The investigator noted a detail that had been overlooked by the local officers: a stolen handkerchief. It was a small, delicate thing, yet it reappeared in the evidence lists across different districts. This was the thread. The killer was not just taking lives. He was carrying pieces of his victims with him, moving like a phantom between the mining shafts and the public gardens. The ledger revealed a man who was becoming more confident, someone who understood the slow machinery of the Soviet militia and used its own bureaucracy against it. The investigator began to see that the perpetrator was likely someone who appeared entirely ordinary, perhaps a family man or a diligent worker who could vanish back into the morning shift without a second glance from his peers. As the heat of August settled over the city, the entries in the ledger began to change in nature. The investigator noticed a terrifying shift in tactics. Previously, the attacks had occurred under the cover of night, in the blind spots of the street lamps. But then came the report of Ekaterina, a woman working in a simple construction trailer. The crime had been committed in the middle of the afternoon, in the bright, unforgiving light of day. This entry was marked with a red underline. It signaled a killer who was no longer afraid of being seen. Or perhaps, a killer who felt so invisible in his everyday life that he believed he could walk through a crowded yard with a hammer in his hand and remain a ghost. The file contained a witness statement from someone who had seen a young man entering the trailer, but the description was frustratingly vague. An average build, a quiet face, someone who looked like he belonged to the landscape of the mine. The investigator realized then that they were not looking for a monster with a twisted visage, but for a man like Sergey Shcherbakov, an underground electrician who knew how to navigate the dark and wait for the perfect moment of vulnerability. The methodical process of connecting these threads required the investigator to revisit the early life of their phantom. He began to cross-reference military discharge papers with the dates of the crimes. He found records of a young man who had served in the army and had been caught stealing ammunition, a small crack in a facade of obedience. The ledger was now more than a record of deaths. It was a psychological map. Each victim, from the pregnant woman to the teenage girl, represented a specific kind of rage that the investigator was trying to decode. He saw the systematic abuse Sergey inflicted upon his own wife, Irina, which was buried in a separate pile of domestic complaints that had never been linked to the murders. It was only when the ledger was viewed as a whole that the terrifying truth emerged. The killer was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very social structures that were supposed to maintain order. He was the exemplary family man who walked his wife to work because he claimed to be afraid of the very maniac he saw in the mirror every morning. The investigator leaned back, the yellow light of the lamp flickering. The threads were tied, but the man was still moving through the city streets. The final entries of that summer in the militsia's ledger were the most difficult to read. They spoke of a city paralyzed by rumors, where school children whispered about card games and cursed movie tickets, unaware that the real danger was an electrician with a hammer. The investigator closed the book, the heavy cover thudding against the desk. He had the pattern now. He knew the districts, the timing, and the specific, cruel signature of the items taken from the scenes. He knew that the man they were hunting was likely working a double shift at the mine, even as the sun began to rise. The task ahead was no longer about finding the pattern, but about catching the man before the next page of the ledger had to be turned. In the silence of the office, the investigator could almost hear the heartbeat of the city, a million people breathing in the dark, unaware of how close the shadow was to their doors. He gathered the folders, the weight of the evidence feeling like lead in his hands. The hunt was no longer a series of questions, it was a countdown. The ledger was full, and the time for observation had passed. Now, the militia had to step out of the archives and into the path of a killer who believed he was already home. The industrial heartbeat of Lenin's Kuznetsky in 1985 was a low, rhythmic thrum that never truly fell silent. It was a city defined by the earth beneath it, where the Yaroslavsky mine exhaled a constant plume of gray soot and steam into the Siberian sky. In the early autumn of that year, a peculiar weather pattern settled over the Kemerovo region. A thick, milky mist rolled off the rivers and pooled in the low-lying industrial zones, clinging to the brickwork of the factories and the iron frames of the construction cranes. It was a heavy, damp shroud that muffled the world, turning the clatter of tramcars into distant, ghostly echoes. For the residents, the mist was a nuisance, a layer of moisture that chilled the bones and blurred the outlines of the familiar. But for one man, a quiet observer whose name would eventually find its way into a restricted ledger, the mist became the backdrop for a sight that would haunt his waking hours and his deepest dreams for decades to come. Our witness was a simple man of habit, a worker whose life was measured in shift rotations and the slow, steady climb of the morning sun. On the day that Ekaterina Lizanova went to work at the construction trailer, the mist was particularly stubborn. It did not lift with the noon hour, but stayed curled around the wooden footpaths and the temporary structures of the building site. The witness was walking a path he had trodden 1,000 times before, his boots making a soft, damp sound against the packed earth. As he approached the vicinity of the trailer, the air felt thick enough to taste, flavored with the metallic tang of coal dust and the scent of wet timber. He paused for a moment to adjust his coat, and that was when the movement caught his eye. A silhouette shifted within the white haze, a figure that seemed to emerge not from a doorway, but from the very vapor itself. It was a young man, moving with a focused, almost clinical grace that felt entirely out of place in the chaotic landscape of a construction zone. The young man was slender, his posture upright and confident. Even from a distance of 30 or 40 meters, the witness could tell this was not one of the regular laborers. There was no soot on his brow, no weariness in his stride. He watched as the figure approached the construction trailer where Ekaterina worked alone. The stranger did not knock or hesitate. He slipped inside with the fluid ease of someone returning to their own home. There was a brief, sharp creak of the door hinges, a sound that the witness would later describe as the snapping of a dry twig in a silent forest. Then, the door clicked shut, and the mist swallowed the trailer once more. To an outsider, it was a mundane moment, perhaps a delivery or a message being passed. But the witness felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of his neck. The stillness that followed was too deep, too absolute. He stood there for several minutes, waiting for the man to emerge. But the only movement was the slow, spiraling descent of a single yellow leaf, landing softly in the mud. In the Soviet Union of 1985, suspicion was a survival instinct. To see something unusual was a burden, not an opportunity. As the witness continued his walk, the weight of that sighting began to press upon him. He thought of the rumors that had been circulating in the communal kitchens and the bread lines, whispers of women disappearing, of a shadow that moved through the private sectors of the city. To go to the militia was to invite the state into your life. It meant hours of questioning in rooms with peeling paint and single, buzzing light bulbs. It meant the risk of being viewed not as a witness, but as a person of interest. The psychological pressure was immense. He wrestled with the memory as the day turned to dusk. He pictured the young man's face, which he had only glimpsed in profile, a face that seemed handsome, almost delicate, hidden beneath the brim of a cap. He didn't know yet that the man was Sergey Shcherbakov, the underground electrician known to some as the Spider, who carried a heavy hammer in his pocket like a hidden tooth. When the news finally broke that Ekaterina had been found in that very trailer, the witness felt a wave of nausea that stayed with him for days. The realization that he had watched the predator enter the nest was a poison. He finally walked into the local station, a gray concrete monolith that smelled of tobacco and wet wool. The investigators were tired, their eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep and the frustration of a case that seemed to slip through their fingers like sand. They sat him down at a wooden table and asked him to repeat his story. Over and over he described the mist, the silhouette, and the way the door had closed. He spoke of the young man's gait, the way he seemed to glide. The officers took notes with scratching fountain pens, their expressions unreadable. They asked if he could identify the man from a photograph, but in the white haze of that morning, the features had been blurred. All he could offer was a feeling, a sense of profound, calculated wrongness that didn't fit the peaceful face of the handsome young electrician the city would eventually come to fear. The testimony of the witness in the mist was a turning point, though not in the way he had hoped. It provided the investigators with a timeline, a confirmation that the killer was bold enough to strike in the light of day, protected by the very environment he called home. But for the witness, the ordeal was only beginning. He became a man caught between two worlds, the mundane reality of his job and the dark memory of that construction trailer. He would find himself staring into the fog on his way to work, half expecting to see that same slender figure emerging from the gloom. The suspicion of the authorities never truly faded. They returned to him several times, searching for details he didn't have, pushing him to remember things the mist had hidden. He learned the hard lesson of that era, that once you see the truth, you can never truly unsee it, and the silence of a witness is often louder than any scream. The Spider was still out there, weaving his web through the industrial heart of the city, and the mist was no longer just weather. It was a memory of a door closing and the terrible stillness that followed. The testimony of the witness in the mist had been a turning point, though not in the way the investigators had initially hoped. It provided a timeline, a cold and rigid framework that allowed the authorities to begin sorting through the mountain of reports that had accumulated over the long, grueling months. As the gray light of a Soviet morning filtered through the frost-patterned windows of the precinct, the investigators turned their attention away from the hazy silhouettes of the street and toward the sharp, black ink of the official records. In the year 1985, the world felt smaller, confined to the rustle of paper and the rhythmic clack of typewriters that echoed through the hallways. It was in this atmosphere of bureaucratic diligence and simmering dread that a new name finally emerged from the white noise of the investigation. It was a name that, until that very moment, had carried no weight at all. It was simply a collection of syllables written in a neat, unremarkable hand on the corner of a dusty ledger. Sergey Shcherbakov. The appearance of the name was not a sudden explosion of clarity, but rather a slow, creeping realization. To the officers leafing through the files, Shcherbakov was just another face in the crowd of workers at the Yaroslavsky mine. The paper felt heavy in their hands, the edges slightly yellowed by the tobacco smoke that hung perpetually in the air of the station. They looked at the biographical details provided by the state. Sergey was a young man, only 23 years of age at the time, and his history suggested a life of quiet conformity. There were no flashing lights or sirens in his past, no grand displays of rebellion. He was described by those who knew him as a quiet, inconspicuous boy, the kind of person who could walk through a room and leave no memory of his presence. As the investigators traced the letters of his name, They couldn't have known that they were looking at the man who would soon be whispered about in the dark corners of the city as the Spider, or the Handsome One. At that moment, he was merely a ghost in the machine of the law. To understand how this name found its way into the records of a murder investigation, we must look back at the quiet life Sergey had led before the spring of 1985. He had grown up in the shadow of the industrial landscape, a child who blended into the gray brick of the schoolhouse and the soot-stained streets. After finishing his 8th grade of schooling, he moved through the world like a shadow, eventually finding himself in a vocational school where he learned the trades of the working class. There was a peculiar silence about him even then. His teachers remembered him as a boy who didn't cause trouble, who sat in the back of the classroom and stared out the window at the distant smoke of the factories. He was eventually drafted into the army, a rite of passage for many young men of his generation. But beneath the uniform, something was beginning to shift. In the barracks, away from the watchful eyes of his mother, Sergey committed a small but telling act of defiance. He stole ammunition. It was a minor incident in the eyes of the military, a footnote in his service record, but it was the first crack in the facade of the quiet boy. When he returned from his service, the world he knew had changed. A girl he had loved, someone he had hoped to build a life with, had not waited for him. She had married another man, leaving Sergey with a hollow sense of betrayal that he could not quite articulate. He moved into the private sector of Lenin's cousin Tesky, taking up a position as an underground electrician at the mine. The work was hard and dark, conducted in the damp bowels of the earth, where the only light came from the flicker of a headlamp. It was a fitting place for a man who preferred the shadows. On the surface, he seemed to be trying to piece together a normal life. He married a woman named Irina, a divorcee who was already pregnant with another man's child. To the neighbors, Sergey appeared to be an exemplary family man. They saw him walking with a pram, his hands steady on the handle, his face a mask of domestic calm. They did not see the hammer he carried in his pocket, nor did they hear the thoughts that raced through his mind as he paced the darkened streets of the city. The duality of his life in 1985 was staggering. By day, he was the husband who would meet his wife at the bus stop, walking her home through the evening chill because he claimed to be afraid for her safety. He spoke of the rumors of a killer on the loose, his voice soft and full of feigned concern. He would kiss her goodbye, and then, under the cover of the deepening night, he would slip away again. He told Irina he was going out to find building materials for an extension on their house, a noble pursuit for a young father. He would push the pram through the silent streets, the wheels squeaking softly against the pavement, but inside the carriage was not a sleeping child. It was the heavy, cold weight of his tools and his intentions. The investigators, looking at his records for the first time, saw only the electrician, the veteran, and the husband. They saw the man who had been scratched by a victim, but had managed to hide the marks beneath the collar of his coat. They were looking at a name that was about to become a focal point of a nightmare. As the investigation deepened, the name Sergey Shcherbakov began to appear more frequently in the margins of the detectives' notebooks. They started to connect the dots between the quiet man at the mine and the sudden, violent attacks that had paralyzed the region. They looked at his shifts, the hours he spent underground, and the hours he spent wandering the city. Every detail was a thread being pulled, slowly unraveling the tapestry of his carefully constructed life. The records showed a man who was becoming increasingly emboldened, moving from small acts of theft to the horrific crimes that would eventually define his legacy. The ink on the page seemed to darken as the sun set over the precinct, casting long shadows across the wooden desks. The name was no longer just a collection of letters. It was a map of a dark journey. The investigators prepared to step out of the office and into the cold air of the streets, ready to find the man who hid behind the pram and the hammer. The quiet life of Sergey Shcherbakov was over, and the records were ready to tell the truth of what he had done in the shadows of 1985. The air in Leninsk-Kuznetsky during the late autumn of 1985 was thick with more than just the usual soot from the coal mines. It was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural for an industrial hub. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shift workers from the Yaroslavsky mine would emerge, their faces etched with the exhaustion of the deep earth, but their eyes scanned the shadows with a newfound rhythm of caution. The city was a landscape of gray concrete and darkening alleys, where the hum of the machinery provided a constant, low-frequency backdrop to a growing sense of dread. For months, a predator had been moving through these streets, a figure the public had begun to whisper about in hushed, terrified tones. The investigators, led by men who had seen the worst of humanity, felt the weight of every ticking second. They knew the circle was beginning to close. But in the world of Soviet criminal detection, a closing circle required the patience of a mountain and the precision of a surgeon's blade. Inside the dimly lit headquarters, the detectives pored over maps of the Kemerovo Oblast. Red pins marked the locations of the tragedies that had unfolded since May. They looked at the gauze bags found at the crime scenes, items of chemical protection that suggested a familiarity with industrial environments. The evidence was a mountain of minutiae, each piece a cold comfort against the loss of 6 lives. The 5th victim, Ekaterina, had been taken in broad daylight, a shift in tactics that signaled a terrifying evolution in the killer's confidence. He was no longer just a ghost in the midnight fog. He was walking among them, perhaps even nodding a polite greeting as he passed. The investigators realized that their target was likely someone who appeared unremarkable, someone who blended into the social fabric of the mining community with ease. They began to look for a man who moved without drawing stares, a man whose domestic life served as a perfect camouflage for the darkness within. Surveillance became the soul of the operation. Plainclothes officers were stationed at the edges of the parks and near the construction trailers, where the work never seemed to cease. They watched the gates of the mines as the shifts changed, looking for a face that matched the vague descriptions provided by witnesses who had seen a young, handsome man in the vicinity of the crimes. The nickname, the Handsome One, began to circulate among the task force, a bitter irony for a man they believed to be a monster. They focused their efforts on the private sectors of the city, the areas where small houses leaned against one another and where an underground electrician like Sergey Shcherbakov might reside. The investigators were looking for a slip-up, a single moment where the mask of the exemplary family man would slip, revealing the predator beneath. They waited in parked cars, their breath fogging the windows, watching the rhythmic swaying of the street lamps and the occasional flickering light of a distant apartment. In the quietude of these stakeouts, the investigators shared whispered theories about the man they were hunting. They knew he was likely around 23 years of age, perhaps with a history of minor infractions like the ammunition theft during his army service. They understood that his violence was fueled by a deep-seated resentment, a jealousy that likely bled into his home life. Reports had begun to surface of a man in the neighborhood who was seen walking with a pram, a young father seemingly tending to his child. It was a picture of domestic tranquility that should have been heartening, yet to the trained eyes of the detectives, something about it felt hollow. They watched him from a distance, noting how he met his wife, Irina, after her shifts, claiming he wanted to protect her from the very danger he himself represented. The irony was a cold stone in their stomachs. They watched the way he pushed that stroller, wondering if the materials he claimed to be transporting were truly for house extensions, or if the heavy weight inside was something far more sinister. The city remained on edge, a collective holding of breath that stretched across the weeks of September. Every evening, as the industrial whistles blew, women would gather in groups to walk home, their footsteps echoing quickly against the pavement. The local party committees and the Ministry of Internal Affairs were demanding results, their pressure trickling down to the men on the ground. The investigators felt the narrowing circle physically, as if the walls of the city were slowly moving inward. They tightened their watch on the Yaroslavsky mine, cross-referencing names of electricians and vocational school graduates. Every lead was a thread, and they were weaving a net that was becoming impossible to escape. They stayed in the shadows, becoming as silent as the man they sought, waiting for that one inevitable mistake that would bring the spider out of his web and into the light of justice. Night after night, the vigil continued. The detectives observed the way Sergey would leave his home in the dark hours, his silhouette disappearing into the unlit corners of the private sector. They saw the way he moved with a hammer concealed in his pocket, a tool of his trade turned into a weapon of terror. The tension was nearly unbearable for the men in the surveillance vans, their hands hovering near their radios, waiting for the command to move. They had to be certain. In the Soviet legal system of 1985, the evidence had to be absolute. They watched the narrowing circle of his movements, noting how he circled back to the same areas, drawn to the hunt like a moth to a dying flame. The air grew colder as winter approached, the first frosts dusting the coal piles with a white sheen. The net was taut, the investigators were in place, and the city of Leninsk-Kuznetsky waited for the moment the predator would finally realize that he was the one being hunted. In the fading light of September 1985, the city of Leninsk-Kuznetsky felt like a place held in a cold, iron grip. For months, a shadow had been moving through the dark hours, a presence the local people had begun to whisper about with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The air was thick with the scent of coal dust from the nearby mines and the damp, metallic tang of the coming winter. We find ourselves standing on a quiet street where the industrial silhouette of the Yaroslavsky mine looms in the distance. The detectives have been patient. They have spent weeks sifting through the fragments of a nightmare, looking for a face that would match the sketches of a man seen near a construction trailer. Tonight, the vigil is finally nearing its end. The tension is not a loud or frantic thing. It is a slow, steady pulse, like the ticking of a heavy clock in an empty room. The investigators stayed in the shadows, their breath blooming in small white clouds against the darkening sky. They were watching a young man of 23 years, an electrician whose appearance was almost unsettlingly ordinary. In the official reports, he would later be called the Handsome One, a nickname that stood in gruesome contrast to the violence he carried in his pockets. They watched as Sergey moved with a quiet, inconspicuous grace, the kind of movement that allowed him to blend into any crowd or disappear into any alleyway. There was no outward sign of the spider who had woven a web of terror across the region since May of that year. The investigators knew about the hammer he often carried, sometimes hidden in a pram under the guise of transporting building materials for his home. This mundane detail, a man pushing a stroller through the evening, was the mask he wore to shield his true nature from the world. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the detectives moved with the synchronized precision of men who knew the weight of what they were about to do. There were no sirens, no flashing lights to alert the neighborhood. They wanted this moment to be silent. They followed him as he walked toward a patch of open ground, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. The sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the evening, a rhythmic count of his final steps as a free man. Sergey paused for a moment, perhaps sensing a shift in the air, a slight disruption in the familiar rhythm of the night. He did not turn around immediately. He simply stood there, a lone figure amidst the industrial decay of the Soviet landscape. The detectives closed the distance, their footfalls light but purposeful. This was the cold confrontation, a quiet meeting between the law and a man who had forgotten the value of human life. When the lead investigator finally stepped into Sergey's line of sight, there was a profound and heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that feels thick in the lungs. Sergey looked at the men, his expression remaining remarkably calm, almost curious. There was no frantic scramble for an exit, no desperate reach for a weapon. In that moment, the realization seemed to wash over him not as a shock, but as an inevitability. The detectives saw the reflection of the street lamps in his eyes, cool, detached, and entirely devoid of the warmth one might expect from someone so young. They spoke to him in low, steady voices, the words barely carrying over the distant hum of the mine machinery. They asked him to come with them, and for a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The hammer remained in his pocket, a silent witness to the 6 lives he had taken, but it would stay there, unused and cold. The walk to the waiting vehicle was remarkably short, yet it felt as though it spanned an eternity of quiet footsteps. Sergey walked between the 2 officers, his head slightly bowed, his hands visible and perfectly still. There was a surreal quality to the scene, the arrest of a serial killer occurring with less noise than a passing breeze. As they reached the black car, the door was opened with a soft, mechanical click that echoed against the brick walls of the nearby buildings. Sergey slid into the back seat, the upholstery creaking under his weight as he settled in. Inside the car, the air was stale and smelled of tobacco and old paper. The detectives did not speak much. The gravity of the capture was enough to fill the space. They looked at the man they had caught, trying to reconcile his handsome, boyish features with the brutal reality of the crimes he had committed against women and young girls throughout that long, bloody summer. The car pulled away from the curb, its headlights cutting a path through the gathering mist of the Siberian night. Behind them, the streets of Leninsk-Kuznetsky remained quiet, the residents unaware that the predator in their midst had finally been caged. The cold confrontation was over, replaced by the clinical silence of the interrogation room. The long night was just beginning for the investigators, but for the first time in many months, the city could finally breathe. The shadow was gone, leaving only the damp, evening air and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the mines to keep watch over the sleeping world. The tires crunched over the wet gravel as the car finally slowed to a stop outside the gray, monolithic precinct in the heart of Leninsk-Kuznetsky. The Siberian night air was sharp, a biting cold that seemed to seep through the heavy wool coats of the officers as they led the man inside. This was the moment that would define the long, arduous investigation of 1985. They moved through narrow corridors where the scent of stale tobacco and floor wax hung heavy in the air, a scent that felt frozen in time. Finally, they reached the door to the room that the local investigators had come to call the Room of Echoes. It was a small, square space with thick concrete walls that seemed to swallow sound, and then reflect it back in distorted, ghostly fragments. There were no windows here to mark the passage of time, only the rhythmic, distant drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the bowels of the building. The walls were painted a dull, institutional green that had begun to flake away, revealing the dark, cold stone beneath. In this room, silence was not an absence of sound, but a heavy, physical presence that waited for the truth to be spoken. Sergey Petrovich Shcherbakov sat on a wooden chair that looked far too small for his frame. His eyes were dark pools, reflecting the flicker of the single, unshaded light bulb that dangled from the ceiling on a frayed cord. He did not look like the monster the town had begun to fear. In fact, some had taken to calling him the handsome one because of his symmetric features and composed demeanor. But to the men across the table, he was known by a darker moniker, the Spider. He sat with an unsettling calm, his hands resting flat on the scarred wooden table. The lead investigator, a man with deep lines etched into his forehead from years of chasing phantoms in the dark, did not start with accusations. Instead, he began with the small things, the trivial details of a life lived in the margins. He spoke of Sergey's work as an underground electrician at the Yaroslavsky mine, the long hours spent beneath the earth, and the quiet life he shared with his wife, Irina. It was a slow dance of psychology, where every pause was as significant as the words spoken, and the echo of the investigator's voice seemed to circle Sergey like a predator. The minutes stretched into hours, measured only by the steady, mechanical ticking of a clock that sat on a shelf behind the investigator. Sergey's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rasp, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk in late autumn. He denied everything with a practiced ease, his words echoing off the concrete walls with a hollow, metallic ring. He spoke of his movements on those fateful nights in 1985, weaving a tapestry of half-truths and plausible deniability. He mentioned his wife's pregnancy and the mundane chores of a married man. But the investigator was patient. He knew that the room of echoes had a way of wearing a person down, turning their own lies into a cacophony they could no longer ignore. He watched the way Sergey's eyes darted to the shadows in the corner whenever the conversation veered toward the outskirts of the city, toward those poorly lit private sectors where the streetlights failed and the darkness became absolute. They talked about the tall grass near the riverbanks and the silent witnesses that the Siberian night had tried to hide. Then the investigator leaned forward, his chair creaking loudly in the small space. He brought up a detail that had puzzled many, the baby pram. He asked Sergey why a man would be seen pushing an empty pram through the darkened streets in the middle of the night. Sergey's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched against the wood of the table. He calmly explained that he was simply transporting building materials for an extension to his house, a lie he had told his wife many times. The investigator let that lie hang in the air, letting it echo until it sounded absurd even to Sergey. They both knew the truth tucked inside that pram was far more sinister. It was a hammer, a heavy tool used not for construction, but for destruction. The investigator described the weight of that hammer, the coldness of the metal, and the way it would feel in a man's trouser pocket. He spoke of the victims, starting with Tatiana, the 27-year-old woman who had been released from the hospital for the May holidays, only to meet a shadow in the dark near school number 10. The psychological sparring reached its zenith when the investigator reached into a manila folder and pulled out a single, small object preserved in a clear bag. He placed it slowly on the table, sliding it across the wood until it rested directly in front of Sergey. It was a simple matchbox. The room seemed to grow even colder as Sergey stared at it. The investigator began to describe the matchbox in painstaking detail, pointing out a single, dark spot of blood that had been found at the first murder scene. He spoke of how that tiny speck of red was a bridge between the victim and the man sitting in the room of echoes. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on both men. The echoes in the room seemed to amplify the sound of Sergey's own breathing, which had become shallow and erratic. The investigator didn't raise his voice. He whispered of the girl Sergey had loved before the army, the one who didn't wait for him, the one whose perceived betrayal had turned his heart into a wasteland of resentment and fury. Suddenly, the composure broke. Sergey buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a decade of bitterness. The echoes of his heavy sighs filled the small space, bouncing off the institutional green walls and back into his ears like a confession from his own soul. He started to speak, not in the practiced tones of a liar, but in the soft, defeated voice of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. He admitted to the 6 lives he had taken, recounting details that only the killer could know. He spoke of the hammer, the wire, and the cold Siberian mist that had acted as his shroud. He confessed that the girl from his past had broken his life, and in his twisted logic, the women of Lenin's Kuznetsky had paid the price for her absence. The investigator's pen moved across the paper with a steady, rhythmic scratching sound, recording the admission that would eventually lead to a death sentence and the execution in September of 1988. The room of echoes had finally extracted the truth, leaving only the somber memory of those lost in the shadows of 1985. The atmosphere inside the courtroom of Lenin's Kuznetsky during the final days of 1985 was something one could almost touch. It hung in the air like the early winter frost, biting and unforgiving to the spirit. Sergey Shcherbakov sat behind the cold iron bars of the defendant's cage. a stark and hollow contrast to the nickname, the handsome one, that the local media had once whispered in hushed, terrified tones. There was no charm left in his slumped posture now, only the empty remains of a man who had brought an entire Soviet city to its knees through sheer, unadulterated terror. As the presiding judge began to read the long verdict, the only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen and the distant, muffled thud of boots on the worn wooden floorboards. The sentence was delivered with a cold and clinical precision that matched the gravity of his deeds. Death by firing squad. There was to be no leniency for the 6 lives he had taken, nor for the fear he had sown in the shadows of the Yaroslavsky mine. Along with the ultimate penalty, the court ordered the total confiscation of his property, a symbolic and final stripping away of his existence from the world he had so violently disrupted. The years between the initial sentence and its final fulfillment were long and remarkably quiet within the heavy stone walls of the Kemerovo custody. From 1985 until 1988, the complex wheels of Soviet justice turned slowly, processing various appeals and final pleas for mercy that would ultimately find no purchase in the eyes of the law. During this long interval, the city of Leninsk-Kuznetsky began its own slow, painful process of exhaling. The suffocating shadow that had lingered over the private sector, those residential areas where the streetlights were far too few and the nights felt far too long, began to lift ever so slightly. People started to walk a little slower in the evenings, though the darkness still held a sharp memory of his footsteps. On the crisp morning of September 26, 1988, the final chapter of Sergey Shcherbakov's life was written in a sterile, silent room. The execution was carried out by shooting, a standard practice of the era that sought to end the story as efficiently as it had been lived. There were rumors, of course, that filtered through the tea rooms and factory floors for years afterward. Whispers suggested he had been spared and sent to work in the secret uranium mines, but the official records remain as firm as the Siberian earth. On that late September day, the man who had been the spider of Kemerovo was gone forever. The aftermath of the trial left a scar on the local governance that was just as deep as the trauma felt in the streets. The city prosecutor, overwhelmed by the weight of the perceived failures that had allowed the killings to persist for so many months, eventually resigned his post. It was a rare and somber admission of the heavy burden this tragedy had placed on the system. A riot had nearly broken out in the city when the full, horrific extent of the crimes finally became public knowledge. It was a wave of collective anger from a populace that demanded more than just a closed trial. The people needed to understand why the bait-and-switch raids and the intensive night patrols had taken so long to catch a man who lived so inconspicuously among them. Sergey had even lied to his own wife, Irina, about the contents of the pram he pushed through the mud, claiming he was merely moving building materials. The community's fundamental trust in the safety of their own doorsteps had been shattered, and it would take many decades for the street lamps to feel like beacons of safety once again. As we sit here in the quiet of the present, we must remember the names that were nearly lost to the static of history. Tatyana Berdyugina, who had been looking forward to a future that was stolen from her and her unborn child in the month of May. Nadezhda Medvedeva, who was simply finishing a long night shift, her mind likely drifting toward the breakfast she would prepare once she reached home. And young Vera Kolesnikova, only 15 years old, whose life was cut short in the lush greenery of Gorky Park. Their stories are the ones that truly matter, the ones that anchor the history of Leninsk-Kuznetsky to something more human than just a criminal file. Even those who survived the attacks, like Tatiana Galkina, carried the physical and emotional marks of that July afternoon for the rest of their lives. These survivors became the living proof of a community's resilience. They were the ones who finally broke the silence, providing the small, crucial details that led investigators to the door of an ordinary underground electrician who hid a monster within. Now, as we look back from the safe distance of many decades, the events of 1985 feel like a fever dream that has finally broken. The fragility of peace is a sobering thought, a reminder that the safety we often take for granted is built on the vigilance and the courage of those who refuse to let the darkness win. The Yaroslavsky mine still stands, and the streets of Kemerovo have changed their faces, but the lessons of that year remain etched in the silence. We learn that even in the most obscure corners of the world, justice has a long memory and a steady, patient hand. The shadows are just shadows again, and the sounds of the night are merely the wind moving through the trees or the distant, rhythmic hum of a city at rest. There is a profound and deep comfort in knowing that even the most difficult stories have a definitive end, a point where the heavy book is closed and the library is finally still. The air around you is calm and cool. The world outside your window is settled now, draped in the soft, velvet stillness of the present hour. Whatever weight you have carried through your day, whatever echoes of the past have lingered in your thoughts, let them drift away into the dark. The heavy iron doors of the past have closed, the courtroom is empty, and the streets are bathed in a soft, peaceful light. You have traveled through the shadows and returned safely to the steady rhythm of your own breath. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.